viewing humans as the essential point of departure for any analysis that relates to economics or sociology or anthropology or law or whatever. If you try to begin with some sort of arbitrary, conceptualized collective that overlooks the individual, this is what we call, it will end up in repression, because the collective becomes the focus of the analysis or the purpose of the institutions that we're looking at. So, and this is, what I do. I mean, I've been a professor since started teaching courses in 1971. And I've had a conversion. I was trained as a Chicago positivist. My dissertation was a econometric analysis of female unemployment, so I was sort of interested in econometrics and statistics and labor markets in particular. And then I moved outside the U.S. in 76 or 7. And then I started focusing on like international issues, capital markets, trade flows. And I'd actually gone to an Austrian Economics seminar. And I said, well, this is very quaint. They have this sort of strange, complex terminology, praxeology, catalactics. Well, anyway, it's all about free markets, so they must be nice people. I didn't get it. And it took me, so I say I'm an Austrian by accident. I had no training, and whatever I had didn't help. I had to, when I lived in London, I went to a lot of secondhand bookshops to buy, classics. So I found, some early Hayek work, but I didn't read Mises initially. I read Hayek. Hayek was more, Mises' prose is very Germanic, sorry. Even Hayek's is a little bit, but it's manageable. But I found Mises a little bit obscure. So I say that I approached Austrian economics through Hayek, but I learned economics through Mises. So that's kind of my sort of development in being within this sort of constellation of people that are interested in Austrian economics. Okay, well, I was just filling up the air. Sorry, I talked about myself too much, but okay. So what? In a way, this is not a bad thing. I was thinking, well, it's kind of like a class. It'll be the same people every night, so there will be some overlapping. So I apologize to people who were here last night, but this, as an economist, I've always been interested in other fields of inquiry. When I was a young professor, I read a fair amount in psychology, sociology, and not much in philosophy because, again, it was sort of, obscure to me. But as I became more interested in the foundations of economic analysis, then I became interested in the law because property rights became so important as a way of understanding how the economy operates. So I developed sort of a broader view. It's many years, of course. It took me a long time to get to where I am today. So what we're going to do tonight is look at, how markets and private property are an underpinning, a foundation for a system of justice and give us some sort of insights into what is moral behavior or moral outcomes. So, this is the idea, and this is my sort of conclusion I'm giving to you in the title, is that private property and market processes, the market, is the basis of justice, moral action, and human liberty, which are obviously interrelated. Now, of course, I mentioned to you that this was Mises' birthday, so I thought I would put up a slide. One of my favorite quotes. I mean, and this is interesting because, as I think I said last night, a lot of the young people, not only in the U.S., but maybe even in Austria, think that socialism is an attractive system. But Mises made a very clear statement on this. It is the antithesis of a system to deliver human liberty. So really, in a sense, we have a question. Do we want to live enslaved? Now, of course, the democratic experiments of the 18th, 19th century, as in modern democracy, was about escaping the enslavement or being slaves to an autocrat, a king or an emperor or czar. So we need to understand several things. Now, of course, all of these ideas are contested. The idea of free will is contested by opponents to these ideas of markets and human liberty. But self-ownership is the absence of slavery. So I own myself, and therefore, whatever I produce, whatever I possess, is mine, and no one should be entitled to take it away from me without compensation or without sort of agreement. So what's happened is that we've allowed, and I mentioned this last night, that democracy has become a form of enslavement, because democracy has become degraded into, instead of being a system to protect human liberty and private property, it's a system to redistribute income or wealth. If we look at democracy as it's practiced in Europe or the United States, North America, Latin America, it's all about redistribution. These are the big questions that the legislators look at every day. How do we redistribute? What do we redistribute? Who is the recipient? Who is the 1% that must give more and more and more? So promoting a collective is not merely unjust, it's against humanity. Now, of course, if you share some of these sort of sentiments that I've expressed, we can look back at the Soviet Union, we can look at the Chinese, Red China, we can look at Kampuchea. We can see the inhumanity that emerged out of the workers' revolution, some collective, promoting a particular interest of a collective, defining that collective, and then protecting it. Inevitably, the individual is suppressed. The individual is ignored. I mean, central planning had no role for the individual. The central plan was about the plan. And the individuals had to accept or be part of the plan, and there was no possibility for resistance. Any resistance would be crushed. Any complaints would be either ignored or punished. So there was no role for individuals in a centrally planned economy. Now, if that's what you define as socialism, now, of course, I think young people don't know what socialism is. They think it's a sort of benign arrangement that will not necessarily lead to barbarism, the kind of barbarism that we saw wherever it's been really carried to its logical extreme. They don't have that sense. Now, socialism is the social or collective ownership of resources, including labor. So labor is owned by the state, just the way that capital is owned by the state, or land, or factories. So, you're not a human. You're just a component of a machine, and expendable. So this is, I think, where the Austrian insights are so important, because it forces us to begin our analysis with the individual as an individual human being.
What is the predecessor of socialism in your mind? Where does it come from?
Well, from the family. I mean, our parents made us socialists, in a sense.
Yes, but
give that to your brother. You know, share that. Now, that's fine if that's where it ends. So we're all socialists in our family. We're all communists in the family unit, because this is the way families operate. I mean, the father or the mother works and they share, according to now, you become a social democrat with an extended family. And that's okay, because you say, well, with your friends, there's some choice. But when you are a mature adult, you must become a libertarian. You must understand that people have the right to be who they want to be. That they're not subject to the sort of family requirement. Now, you remain loyal to your family, your friends. So you remain in those kind of relationships. But as a thinking human being, you have to be more or less a libertarian in terms of pursuing your life purposes. Because your life purposes are different than mine. And I have to respect that you're doing what you're doing. And I will not interfere if I disapprove, unless it involves injury to someone else. So I think it's this sort of enculturation of socialism comes in part from an immaturity, that you think that life is like it was with your family. Well, it's not that way. So I guess that's the way I interpret it. But okay. So what we're going to do then is try to understand again. Human action is self-interest, the way for us to have a moral, a just social order. So, in other words, we're going to ask the question that Adam Smith began. His first book was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So he wanted to know, how do we live together? I mean, so it was a philosophy. This wasn't economics. This was, high philosophy. He was trying to say, how do we live together? Why does it work? You kind of look around and things are working. I mean, maybe you see that they could work better. But I think Smith was initially disappointed, because what he said, human beings are not motivated by their best instincts. They're motivated by their strongest instinct. So he was a little bit disappointed. The best instinct would be socialism, maybe, or altruism. He said, no. Self-interest is really what motivates us. But then in his second book, he said, wait. Self-interest can lead to net social benefits. Because if we're all allowed individually to choose to pursue our self-interest without interfering with other people, without aggression, there'll be net social benefits. So, he was relieved. He thought this thing through and said, wow, So this is the beginning of the idea where self-interest can lead to positive sum outcomes. So that if I advance my well-being in a competitive framework, it'll only be because I'm advancing your well-being, and there's some sort of mutual gains from those transfers. So we're looking for this sort of social rules or guides that will give us these moral and just human actions, that will sort of direct us and encourage us to be moral and to be just. And then we look at a spontaneous order versus an imposed order and see how, and of course, we've had experiments with these imposed orders. Human civilization began with more or less imposed orders, where the strongest or the most numerous were able to dominate the others and require them to behave in certain ways, even if it went against their interests. So we're going to look at these various sort of systems these social orders that we talked about last night. Okay, so again, to be a good economist, you have to begin with scarcity. If you start at any other place with economic analysis, and I believe any sort of social science, you have to start with scarcity. Now, scarcity, as I mentioned last night, the most obvious one to all of us is our mortality. Our mortality is what makes us act. If we were immortal, we would see no need to act, because just kind of hang around and things happen. But again, there's a certain urgency that realizing that you're mortal, or realizing there's only 24 hours in a day. So it doesn't have to be necessarily mortality, because when I was young, I was immortal. I think all of us tend to be. But we do realize that there's only so many hours in a day, and if we want to get things done, we have to make sacrifices of one thing to get another thing done. So this is really what separates the good from the bad economists. Now this is why, as I mentioned last night, Karl Marx was not an economist, or at least he had a poor understanding of economics per se, because he tried to start his analysis beyond this idea of scarcity. He didn't understand that private property is actually the outcome of scarcity. Scarcity is what tells us that private property is a good thing. He said, well, some people have it, some people don't have it, so it's a bad thing. And that's why people are miserable. And, some people own capital and they, exploit other people. And so, but he didn't understand there's another logic behind private property. Private property, as we'll see, is kind of the outcome of what we're trying to do in reaction to scarcity. So what we find is that scarcity leads to conflict. You have to decide how to use resources, how to use your time, how to use your life. You have to make choices, so there are trade-offs. Now, in the wider world, of course, we make these decisions for ourselves, but in the wider world, these conflicts can be problematic. And so we could allow a king to decide how to solve this scarcity problem, or we could allow individuals to use their own value judgments, use their own life purposes, their life goals, as a way to accomplish what they want in their lives. So we could use violence, slavery, and theft. Well, that solves the problem. Right? So, we could, we have conflict over the use of this chair. We can fight for it, and he's going to win it. He'll be stronger. Theft, you want something, you just take it. Slavery, you enslave people. But, over time, people found that's not a very good thing, especially if you're like me, small and weak and old. So we see the sort of evolution away from these ideas. Now the other is peace, liberty, and cooperation. So there could be peaceful solutions to conflicts, where we voluntarily agree that tonight you could sit in that chair, tomorrow night maybe I'll sit in that chair because it's the better chair to sit in or whatever. So cooperation, these are ways that we can solve the problem of scarcity, the conflict. So what happens then, and I think this is what civilization is all about. Civilization is human beings trying to discover a better way to live together. So, we had centuries of violence, slavery, and theft. And of course it was good for the people that were strong and so on and powerful, but it was bad for the rest of us. And then, we began to start thinking, there's got to be a better way. And this is how we've evolved. Now, again, for every 2 steps forward, we usually take 1 step back, or maybe 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But we've progressed. So we've gotten to a point where we really need to articulate how we can live together in a peaceful and harmonious way. In other words, how we can create a social order that is compatible, or that allows each of us to pursue our life purposes as long as we don't use violence, we don't use fraud, we don't engage in some sort of violent behavior.
How do you judge whether you observe progress or regress?
Well, yeah. Again, my argument would be whether or not the individual is more free or not. And this is where we've been moving. Again, if you look back in the distant history, Pharaohs, the Etruscans, Greeks, Romans, the individual per se was not recognized as something that was, an element of society that needs to be elevated. And we sort of, over time, we had serfs, we had slavery, we had all, we moved towards more and more acceptance that the individual should be the ultimate measure of whether we live in a good society. Now, you and I would make that judgment. Now, would that judgment be passed in Venezuela? Or in China at the moment? Or in other places? But those won't last forever. Just like the Soviet Union could not last forever. The Russians began to sort of, understand that being suppressed on the basis of some sort of collective idea was not a great way to live, especially the millions that were liquidated, family members or whatever. So I guess that's the way I would look at it. So human progress is moving towards a space where more individuals are more free to choose their own life purposes and the achievement of their life purposes without using violence or fraud or theft. So private property then is really a key here. And I think this is what is missing in the people who oppose markets. They don't understand scarcity. If you understand scarcity, private property is an escape from that conflict created by an inescapable condition of life, which is scarcity. So property is that I have it, you want it, you could fight me for it, or you could offer me some compensation. And then we decide how that resource is used. And that is a better way. Now, it's not a perfect way. None of this is about human perfection, because there is no human perfection. There's no system of perfection. But it gives us a possibility for an improved life. Now, so basically, we're looking at the only mechanism that we have so far for resolving the conflicts over resources. And property, which is anything that we own, whether it's the clothing or the phone or whatever we might have, we must respect one another's private property as the basis of justice and human liberty. Now, of course, I'm assuming here that you acquired that private property through peaceful means and legal means, without deception, without violence, without force. And once you have that, it cannot be taken away from you, because if it's taken away from you, it's an injustice. If it's taken away from you, it's immoral, because it's yours. And you are valuable as a human being, just as valuable as any other human being. So, now markets are how we transfer property rights. So markets aren't some sort of invention of capitalists to exploit the proletariat. No, markets emerged out of humans wanting to improve their life. And they've engaged other human beings as a way to have a better life. So markets are the most human of all institutions that we live within. So if you're anti-market, that means you're anti-human. Because markets are not, we didn't invent markets as a way of, Elon Musk being a billionaire. No, markets were the outcome of human beings trying to improve their lives while engaging with other human beings that were trying to improve their lives. So, markets are a way that we are encouraged, we're rewarded for behaving in a moral way and treating everyone in the same way that we would treat other people. This is about being human and recognizing other people's humanity. This is what markets do. You will not be successful in a market unless the government is using some force to restrict people from competing with you. You will not be successful if you're immoral, if you use fraud, if you deceive people, and if you treat people badly. You will not be successful. So markets actually are a mechanism by which we discover a sort of a necessity for morality and justice.
Yeah, but the question of morality can be different. If you look at the mafia, they believe in markets, but have a different morality.
Well, I know, but there's force involved, and there's also, the mafia. Now, again, these ideas are not predicting perfection. I mean, there were markets for slavery, or for slaves, right? I mean, but this violates this whole idea. I mean, because it meant that some human beings weren't human beings; they were subhumans. And in the mafia, there is a market-like mechanism, but it involves force. Whereas in the market for laptops, there's no force involved. If you want to be successful selling laptops, you have to sell good ones. The mafia uses other things.
Okay, now, just briefly. Yeah. In a book on ancient Greeks, the author stated that the ancient Greeks fostered markets because they created knowledge.
Yeah.
But this is even going beyond that for me.
Yeah. Well, a price is a compression of knowledge. So when I decide on buying my lunch, that price reveals, my knowledge of, I know what that food is. I know what it tastes like. I know what it's going to do to my stomach. And the other people that are selling it, they accumulated knowledge on where to buy the ingredients, how to prepare it, how to hire people to serve it. So that price, in a way, is really a compression of all this knowledge I want this because I'm in a hurry. He doesn't have to know that. That information is all compressed in the price. And I want this price because I want to pay for my grandmother's hospital bills. I don't have to know that. There's all kinds of information that is involved with that sort of transfer. And it's consolidated in what we call a price. So you're right. I mean, this is what markets are. Maybe it's even more than transfer of property rights. It's transfer of knowledge or information. So, as I mentioned, in my view, civilization is really about our advancement towards finding a better way to live together. A better way to live together is to live morally, to have some, accepted moral guidelines, and treating people as human beings, as equally valuable. And so this is where we have gotten to this point. I mean, look what happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, it was acceptable for, to liquidate, to send people to gulags. But, I mean, even war today, the attitudes about war in World War I, the boys from England said, it'll be over in 2 weeks, let's go. The naivete was incredible. They were eager to go to war. And many people in France and Germany, they let's fight. And today, I think we've evolved beyond some of that. I think there would be a resistance to this sort of idea, going to war. Because we've seen the movies, we know the outcomes. And in some countries, they've actually experienced it more recently, whether in the Balkans or in Ukraine or wherever. So again, I think we're more civilized because human beings are so valuable, we don't want to waste them in a war. And I think this is what we've become. And I think we've advanced in that regard. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be setbacks. But I tried to think about this. But for a social order to be accepted by people, to be stable, then it has to satisfy what they believe, individually and collectively, to be moral and just. Otherwise, there'll be internal pressures to change that order. It may take 70 years. It may take generations. But again, this is what these sort of socialist or communist experiments were about. I mean, people were discovering, this is not a good way to live. Having one autocratic leader, Mao, Stalin, Hitler, whoever it was, that's not the way to live. We go beyond that. So, private property and market processes are one social order. Only one. I mean, there are many other possibilities. But I'm going to suggest to you, and we may have setbacks, but I'm going to suggest to you that this is the possibility for humans to live together in a harmonious, mutually satisfying way. Now, prices are information that's traded by producers and consumers. And what they do is entrepreneurs, they don't know us. They don't care about us. They may not even like us. They don't know who we are, but they produce what we need. And we don't know who they are. I don't know who put together my hand phone. Maybe I wouldn't like them if I met them. Doesn't matter. Markets go beyond that. So what we find is that markets are a way for us to make other people... Markets are really about human happiness. Because if you get that new phone, iPhone 29 or whatever, you feel happy. You buy that bottle of wine, you feel happy. Happier. Good meal, nice car, new shoes. Happiness. I mean, this is what markets are about. It's a search for happiness. It's an opportunity for happiness. Human happiness.
Is that true happiness always?
Well, again,
materialism, yeah?
okay, what is happiness? Well, okay,
Yeah.
Your happiness is different from mine. But that's what the market is about. You pursue your happiness, I pursue my happiness. But we're both happy in a different way. Because we're different humans. This is why these idiotic... The French tried to get a happiness index, gross happiness index. The Bhutanese. I was in Bhutan when they were beginning to talk about this gross national happiness. And I went to talk to the guy who was the head official that was trying to construct. And I said, this is all nonsense. And we talked about, I don't think he really understood what I told him. He said, you need to come back. We need to talk more about this. But I said, there's no collective happiness. This is what you're asking. No, you can't measure. It's an aggregation of something that cannot be aggregated. It's a measurement of something that cannot be measured. It cannot be measured because it is individualized and subjective. And your happiness changes over time. Your happiness, you prefer green, but then you see someone else that you admire and you prefer blue. These things change. So why did I wear green? It makes me unhappy. I have this, but now I have this blue pullover. Again, these are very subjective things. So, but it is our individualized search for happiness. This is what markets are about. Now, so you don't even need to own anything necessarily, because what's happening in the market is that it is creating a system that encourages people to cooperate. And we're all part of it. So we have these sort of, we have a shared life together where we can depend upon this cooperative arrangement to seek happiness, individualized. Now, of course, what happens is that, and I think the young people who did not live through the horrors of the tensions of the Cold War, or the horrors of Vietnam War, and my generation, or the people that have lived a different life than we have, will not learn necessarily from the failures of other social orders. So the Soviet social order, it was a social order, right? It was, it was predictable, it was, stable, and it was a system of human interactions. Now, each generation has its own sort of understanding of those things. My generation, or maybe yours, had direct experience with some of these things. And the horrors that went along with it. Then the current generation says, well, that's history. We will do it differently. They're optimistic, perhaps, or ignorant, uninformed. They think that emotions will carry them into a sort of blissful future. And most of us don't learn from our own mistakes. I mean, that's hard enough, but it's very difficult to really And we see this through history, where people will try to experiment with the same sort of arrangements that completely failed. So again, this is the seductive lure of socialism. Socialism is about altruism. If only other people would give up more of what they own, not what I own. But because that's what socialism is basically. I want you to give up what you own and don't bother me. I think this is a kind of the immature sort of approach to socialism. Because they think that it's just transfers from people that have more to people that have less. But what about the humanity of the people that had more? That you've now forced to have less? Is that a net gain for humanity? Now, you say, wow, but... So they overlook the costs, and they see socialism only as a benefit. A gain, a net gain for humanity. Well, it can't be a net gain, because you had to take away from someone else. You had to treat them as an inferior element of the society in order to promote this particular recipient.
How you describe socialism is rather how it's marketed. Effectively, it's that some individuals want to dominate the social order and extract economic resources from the others. Yeah. So it's a quite individualistic approach of the elites.
Yeah. Well,
it's a kind of a new feudal system.
I think you're right, but I think a lot of people pretend that it's not that. That it's something that is humane.
That's the marketing.
That is humane. Exactly. And again, I think young people really, they don't have a good definition for socialism. It's just sort of, because all of the questions, they say, do you like socialism or you're not like? They don't say, this is socialism, blah, 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 blah. They just say, what do you think about socialism, good or bad? So that's, we don't know what the content is.
I had to think about this for a little bit, but I think I have to push back a little bit against this striving for happiness, that this is something good, because I think that striving for... Let me start in a different way. I think happiness is an epiphenomenon of successful challenges. It's not something we should strive for. We should even strive for challenging environments, so we can experience true happiness. If we have a society where individuals strictly strive for happiness, I fear that this leads to some kind of striving for some comfort and comfortable happiness, which leads to weak people, which leads to fragile people. Yeah. So I think this is something where the whole libertarian order could collapse if we allow people to really strive for some kind of comfortable happiness.
Let me add a word. Perhaps I think it's easier to think about markets and happiness when you think of your health insurance, a wonderful book that you buy, a painting, education that you buy by attending a course or whatever. That's all in the market as well, and that's perhaps a different kind of happiness than the iPhone.
But some people would say that the iPhone is the happiness, right?
So yes.
So there are some. I think there's a short-term, long-term difference there, right? Some people go for like quicker gratification, perhaps, than.
I'm not a deep thinker. What my understanding is, we go into the market to make our lives better. We don't go in the market to make our lives worse. Now, making my life worse would make me unhappy. Now, if I'm making my life better, one way you could describe that, happy. Now, I'm not thinking in a deep sort of philosophical way. If we just consider, why do we interact with each other in the market? Well, we want to get in a better position than we were previously. Now, is that going to make you? I mean, it's really about, maybe we could call it human flourishment. We could use other reference points. And again, I don't have an allergy to happiness, because I see it again as a subjective and an individualized outcome that will be different for each of us. But I think that what motivates us is the search for that improvement. Now, again, we could argue whether that's happiness and whether or not that should, that you go to a prostitute and you're happy. Well, no, you shouldn't be because you of that arrangement. But it's what motivates you to act. It's that search. So again, I'm not trying to create a sort of a deep philosophical argument about what should happiness be. I don't have any idea. You said true happiness. What's true happiness? There's no absolute happiness. There's no true happiness. It's what you decide. And what you decide today makes you happy will make you miserable tomorrow. Perhaps. Because you have new information, you have new values, and so you are constantly reevaluating what it is that's a meaningful life.
Now, would you agree that to have a libertarian system that functions in long term, you need institutions that don't take away the challenge? Like, for example,
don't take away the challenge.
Because, for example, the welfare state leads to the possibility to have some kind of comfortable happiness. And I think really this is where the problem lies. This is probably the main argument I would levy against the welfare state. Mm-hmm. It leads to the foundations of a functioning society being undermined.
Yeah,
the main argument against the welfare state is the theft that is occurring. It's not that it renders you happy.
Yeah.
Well, from a deontological perspective, I agree.
Yeah.
It's a moral issue, not an issue.
Well, yes, of course we can discuss about morals, but I'm really focusing now on function. What is the result? What is the consequence? I'm not arguing on a moral basis.
Yeah, and I mentioned last night.
That's why you need philosophy now. Yeah. Okay, we have a dispute which can only be solved in philosophy, not just in economics.
Well, I see a lot of the problems that we have at the present time, which I think is what he's getting at, can be traced back to the development of the welfare state, which is just a game of redistribution, which is it's one of the validations of democracy. Well, it's not. Democracy was about protecting human liberty and private property. At least modern democracy. Not the Greeks, not the Romans, not the others. But the modern democracy that we're living within today was never meant to be a redistribution game. To take away from one. Because taking away from one person is taking away their private property. And using force to do it. Or either explicit or the threat of force. So I think you're right in a way. I mean, we get to the point where we've been dehumanized by the welfare state. We just want the 1% to give us more. We don't think about who they are, how they got the money, if they got the money legitimately or illegitimately. We just want them to give more. So we dehumanize them, and the recipients are made into dependents that aren't looking after themselves. They've been dehumanized as recipients because they're the people that become soft and demanding, and the politicians promising to give more. So I think the welfare state is really at the heart of our conflicts in this regard. We're not going to reverse it, but I think if we come to an understanding that that's what the problem is, maybe we can move the way Argentina is trying to move away from the collapse of the Argentine state is based upon Peronism, which was the welfare state in an exaggerated form. Excess debt, underperformance of the economy because of high tax rates, and it was all to fund the welfare state. And Javier Milei, is trying to reverse that. And if he's successful, it might be a lesson for the rest of us. But anyway, okay, listen. Now, morality, again, morality is not an objective position. Morality changes in the attitudes about what is moral across cultures, across generations, over time, from person to person. But there's still some general sort of concepts of what is moral. The use of violence is, in most people's eyes, immoral. Murder is immoral. Or if you just take a simplistic list of the Ten Commandments, I mean, it's a kind of a moral code that most people more or less understand. Now, of course, we're all at some moment, as long as we're competent mentally, we're going to engage this idea of, is what I'm doing good or bad? And I think even, say, a murderer or the mafia, they know what's good and bad. And they might like doing bad, getting away with it. But they still know that they still have a sense of morality, even if they violate it. Now, but what we need to understand is that it's a matter of individual choice to be moral or not. You cannot impose morality. If you behave in a certain way because you're forced to behave, you didn't do it out of any sort of moral guide. You did it because you didn't want to be punished or you didn't want to be ostracized. So, moral outcomes are really only based upon individual choices and individual actions. So when government officials say it's the moral thing for the 1% to give more so that we can give to the people who don't have, the refugees, the asylum seekers, the poor, the dispossessed. This is nonsense. Because those transfers are compelled. There was no morality in taxation or in governance. So you cannot pretend. Now, of course they do. Politicians will always pat themselves on the back for their moral behavior. But they're behaving in an immoral way because they're treating those that they take from as something to be used in order to support those that have not. But what is the moral justification for that? Human beings. So making this one better off makes this one worse off. That's a zero-sum outcome. That means that one human is the master in a sense and the other is a slave. And you're compelled to behave. So political agents are constantly telling you how moral they are. Well, if they want to help the poor, give your own money. Don't give his money. That's a moral act. When I help the poor out of my own decision, that is a moral act. But taking from him to give to another is immoral. It's unjust. What's the moral justification for taking from one? So this is why democracy was never meant to be about redistribution. Because democracy was about liberty of all human beings, about private property of all human beings, not as a way of finding the political force to compel transfers. It's complete nonsense. Now, how did we get here? We let them do this to us. We were asleep. They kept saying, it's about democracy. But it's not about democracy. Well, it is. I mean, it's a democratic process. but partly because we believe them. Oh, it's moral. This is where, I'm not an objectivist, but this is where Ayn Rand, I think, has some insights for us. This sort of, this idea of altruism, sacrificing yourself. Now, if you choose to sacrifice yourself based upon your own, desire to help someone, that's a much different process than having it taken from you based upon someone else's sense of altruism that's just invented. And it's invented as a way to be popular, to win votes probably. So morality is just something, it's just there. Now, again, we test the limits of morality. Over time, the way we dress has changed. What was immoral at one point becomes acceptable at another point in time. If you go to the tropics, women will wear bikinis, men will wear shorts and no shirt. Wouldn't be acceptable here. It wouldn't be necessarily immoral, but you see that, well, it's not the right way, right? So, now, most of us make judgments, of our own, based upon our experience, based upon our family background, based upon our life purposes. So we know what morality is. I mean, there was a famous court case about pornography, and one of the judges said, well, there's no absolute definition of pornography, but I know it when I see it. So that means, well, pornography changes over time. But again, it's how you sort of adjust to these sort of changing conditions of life. So it's what gives us our. Now, some of you, maybe all of you, are willing to help people that you know, maybe in your family, or people that you know in your neighborhood that might need help. Or you may not, because you say, well, I didn't cause that problem, so why should I feel responsible for that other person? And some of you say, well, I know I didn't cause that problem, but I just think it's the right thing to do. So again, we have this sort of, we develop our own sense of what our duties are to each other. Now, the primary duty that we all have to each other, avoid aggression, avoid fraud, keep your promises, right? And so we have these sort of basic obligations. But beyond that, it's up to you. So don't use aggression, don't engage in fraud, and then after that you decide what your relationship is with the other people. So the state cannot enforce morality. Not in a real sense, because it's force. The state is force. So we need to get away from this sort of idea that politicians behave in a moral manner. They don't. Because of what they do. They are in possession of political power. There's no morality in that. It cannot be. Judges can't tell us. A judge is another human being. So that's immoral. Well, how do you know? It's immoral to smoke marijuana, or it's illegal at one point. And the reason it was illegal because it was thought to be immoral, because it would lead to immoral behavior. But most people don't believe that now. They did at one time. So the idea that courts are the ultimate source of morality is nonsense. That governments are the ultimate source of morality is nonsense. And they can't change or invent. They can't force us to change our moral behavior if it is our true understanding of what is right and wrong. And passing laws will not change that. We had prohibition of alcohol in the United States because it was immoral. So they made it illegal. But people drank anyway. They didn't think it was immoral. So making a law against it doesn't change your understanding of what is good or bad. And government mandates don't lead to moral outcomes because they are mandates. They have the force of law behind them. They have the force of the courts, the judge, the police.
But excuse me, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Morality. I mean, take the core with the Ten Commandments, for example.
Yeah.
And I mean, the circumstance can change. Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
But then, of course, there are many reasons that you're allowed to kill if you protect something or fight against an evil. You know, so it's
well, of course,
not so easy.
And maybe the subtext of that is thou shalt not die in following this rule. So, I mean, again, there is something more to those commandments because we know that self-defense is acceptable. Now, okay, here's the rule of law. Now, this is my understanding of what justice is. Oh, we went over time. I was having fun. I have nothing better to do. I'm sorry to say that.
Well, it wasn't in 1930.
Yeah.
1930. So
Okay.
45.
Now here we are. So, what is the rule of law? Well, the rule of law is a system of rules that are systematic and not arbitrary. They don't change because the leaders of the political system change. So they're sort of systematic rather than being imposed arbitrarily by the political leadership. Everyone must be treated equally. This is the essence of the rule of law. That political leaders are not above us as citizens. They cannot commit fraud. They cannot commit murder. They must be held accountable in the same way that you are. So this is, I mean, of course, in modern democracies, they ignore this because they will blockade the roads. Where was I? In Uganda. We were leaving a restaurant and the roads were blocked. Well, we couldn't move. I said, what's going on? I said, well, the president is moving around. Well, he was still having drinks and he screwed around wherever he was. And we were sitting for like 2 hours waiting for this idiot. Well, why? Why should thousands of people have their lives disrupted so this idiot could hang around and, you know. Now maybe you could justify, a 20-minute delay or something, right, because of security. But, again, he was completely detached from the impact on other people because it's so important. And this is what happens. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, it's a real problem. But this is what the rule of law was about, to try to get that away from them. But what have we done? Over time, political leaders are above us. Or they tend to behave as though they were. There was an instance where it was Tom Daschle. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And he lost his position, and he was voted out of office. And 2 years later, they found out that he had a government car and driver. And he said, oh, I wasn't supposed to have that? Of course not. He had it because he was the Speaker of the House. But once he wasn't, he just kept it because, this is what happens. People, they become above us. We are their servants. Democracy was about them being our servants. We were meant to be the masters. But they have become the masters, and we have become the servants. Now, this idea of the rule of law is really about fairness, that everybody is treated equal, no privileges. So no, escorts, traffic jams for presidents going on. Like in India, it would be just some minor government official. They would shut down the traffic in New Delhi for hours so that one clown could go from one side of town to the other. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Now, privileges. They assign themselves privileges. High salaries, nice pensions. In America, if you go in the House of Representatives, you're there for one 2-year session, you have a pension for life, once you retire. Well, who voted for that? They did. You didn't, we didn't. They voted it for themselves. They've created privileges for themselves. Now, so if we're equal, then we have to accept. But planning is an individual decision. It's not a collective decision. You cannot plan for me. You don't know what I want to accomplish. You don't know what I want to do or be. I don't know what you want to do or be. I cannot plan for you. I can give you advice, but I can't plan. I can't create conditions that allow you. Now this is very important. Voluntary transfers are both moral and just. Now, of course, there's some things that we don't, maybe an atomic bomb. I mean, okay, there's limits. But again, this is sort of a concept. If people have things and they voluntarily choose to transfer them, the outcome of that transfer is moral because both parties believe it's reasonable, and it's just. And both parties felt that it was a fair transfer. So in other words, voluntary transfers in markets are really one of the very few instances where humans engage in morality and justice. Because you can't create morality through legislation. You can't impose it through the courts. You discover what is moral by these human interactions. You make a decision whether it's just, that is, the transfer is fair, it's reasonable. So, reasonable and fair. Justice is measured of outcomes. So we can't talk about social justice. There's no social justice. Society doesn't mistreat me. You mistreat me. You decide that I'm different from you, so you mistreat me. You treat me differently. The idea that there are classes of individuals that are somehow inferior, it has to be decided by the other individuals to accept that. It's not something that exists outside of the individual choices. Whatever these social outcomes are, they're all based upon individual choices. Not a collective membership in a group, or not a collective sort of attitude about things. It's an individual attitude. So racism, it's not a social problem, it's an individual problem. You have a different idea about people from a different race. And of course, then it depends on how you react to that. More Mises, less Mars. So this Mises focused on the individual as a human being. Marx saw people as members of groups. Capitalist, proletariat. Well, you're going to come up with people that like green cheese and people that I don't know. You make up stuff. I mean, what's the collective? Collectives are a sort of an invention, a conceptualization. They don't have You cannot cut a class. You cannot cut a group. You can cut me. I will bleed. They're not real. It's just made up. But this is what happens with academics. We try to make this unreal thing real. And, then politicians love that because then they use that as a way of dividing us. That's the other thing about democracy. Democracy is meant to bring people together. What has happened? We've been driven apart because of this the welfare state, redistribution. We divide people. We don't have a sort of a sense of, shared purpose. Now, so when we talk about markets, and this is a real problem. People think that markets are an invention, but it's an act of humans. If you don't like markets, you don't like humans. Being opposed to markets is being against people being individual, trying to make their lives better by making other people's lives better. Now, of course, markets lead to imperfect outcomes. I want to be rich. I want a Maserati. But I didn't really try to make enough money to make a Maserati. Maybe I would have gotten one if I wanted. But I could be disappointed and blame you for it. No, it was my choice. Again, a lot of the sort of attacks on markets are really resentment of the imperfections of other humans. So we say, well, it's because you're greedy or you don't care about me. Now, we have to understand that human values are constantly changing. So again, this subjectivity of human values is very important in this context. And this is part of this, focusing on the individual. Because if we understand what the individual is, and that their ideas, their life purposes, their values will change over time as they get new information, as they become older. Our time preferences change over time. Young people are what I call high discounters. You have to give them a lot to delay gratification. Right? That's why people get drunk. Kids get drunk. They want to have good times now. You have to pay them a lot to not do those things. And when you get older, you say, well, I've done that. Compensation won't be as great. So things change over time. So our taste and preferences change because we have new information. We have children. We have, whatever. We have responsibilities. Changes everything. New information, technology, expanding markets. Who knew what we were going to buy from China 20 years ago? Markets have expanded where we have things that we never imagined, at prices we couldn't imagine 20 years ago. So, voluntary market exchange are really about humans cooperating with other humans. Again, we're not talking about a perfect system where everybody is equally happy, satisfied. But I think we need to understand that allowing these markets to operate is a way for us to discover shared morality and a acceptance about what is justice, fairness. I'll use justice as kind of a reference to fairness. And this is what markets do for us. And this is what I think is lost. Because markets are seen as some sort of unhuman arrangement. Because they really don't understand what markets are about. Markets are just about transfers. Transfers of knowledge, information, resources. So, okay. Well, I think that Now, my understanding of a natural law is not based on a religion. I'm not saying that God gave us these, but the way I look at this, and again, I'm not a deep thinker. I'm just thinking, because you are human, you are naturally entitled to the same rights that I am. I mean, it's just natural because, well, we're both humans, right? So it's natural in that sense that we should be treated equally. So for me, I mean, natural rights or natural law has a philosophical pedigree, and there's debates about it from, like religious or philosophical. But I'm just taking it from a very sort of basic sort of position. You're human, and because of that, by nature of being human, you're equal to me. So you're entitled to own yourself, and whatever you possess or create peacefully, lawfully, without fraud, without violence, is yours. So this is really why we moved away from slavery. We began to say, well, every human being should be the master of their own destiny. Again, there are people who are incapacitated physically or mentally, whatever. But in general, I mean, we can't build our lives by the outliers, by we'll have to take care of them later. What we need to do is try to find a way for most of us. Again, this is somewhat maybe narrow philosophically, but this is a way for most of us to have a better life. Now, who has the first claim over your income? The government. Fool. How did we get there? You should have the first claim to your income. And, they say, well, if there's anything left, it's yours. How did we get there? We let them do this to us. Democracy has become something for them to decide on what they do with our lives. And we sort of, well, one of the famous British judges said, taxation is the cost of civilization. That's bullshit. Civilization is about improving people's lives. Taxation is about redistribution. Because taxation, as we know it now, is taxing from one person to give to another. A subsidy, protection, whatever. So rightful possession. So we can not engage in slavery, not engage in violence, fraud, or theft. So if we have rightful possession, and again, we could develop a philosophical argument. Well, where did it all begin? Well, that's the classroom. This is the reality. That's his property. I don't have to know that 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, that someone acquired a piece of land and produced cotton or whatever. No, this is what happens today. He peacefully acquired that possession. Markets are really about humans improving their lives. I call it a search for happiness. Just as a way, in a kind of a frivolous way, to get my students to think about, really what happens when you go to McDonald's. I don't go to McDonald's, wherever. Because it makes you happy. I don't know why. I think it's a bad product, but you might like it. But generally, this is what we're doing. We're looking for some satisfaction. Okay, satisfaction. Use another word. And we are not good judges of what satisfies or makes other people happy. We should be humble about that. We should understand that we cannot decide for someone else. Now, without the rule of law, all of these things fall apart. We got to where we are today, as good or bad as things may be, because we discovered that the rule of law is a metaphysical concept, that everyone is treated equally, no privileges, legislation cannot be passed to create privileges for one group against another. And the embrace of the rule of law was really at the heart of these democratic experiments that began in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So this is where I'll leave it. If you're opposed to markets, you're opposed to humans. Or you really just don't understand what markets are about. Was Karl Marx anti-human? Well, if you look at his individual personal behavior, you would say yes. He was a pretty nasty piece of work privately. It doesn't say anything about his philosophy, whether he was coherent or intelligent. It's just that the way he treated other human beings showed that he really didn't hold human beings in very high regard, because he treated and mistreated his own children, his own family, in a very bad way. But so, how can we make people understand this better? I mean, because activists see government as the solution as opposed to the problem. Because government is political power. And I ended last night, and I'll repeat it again. Political power is what we must be afraid of. Political power is permanent. It's difficult to challenge. It doesn't disappear. Economic power is contested. It evaporates. It disappears. Technology changes. Taste and preferences change. Steve Jobs dies. Whatever it is. Whatever economic power you have, you will not see that same power over a very long period of time. And unless it is protected by the state. But political power is protected by the state. It's the purpose of the state. It's the acquisition and it's the expansion. And it's a distortion that has occurred over time. So we need to make, in my case, in teaching young students, to understand that political power is our enemy. It's the enemy of human liberty. It's the enemy of property rights. And therefore, it goes against our sort of capacity to be human. So, of course, you know who this is. Who talks about alienation, rootlessness. Now, Karl Marx was a great champion of historical materialism. The problem was he didn't understand history, and he misrepresented materialism. Materialism is your fault, not mine. In other words, it was something that he imagined everybody else suffered from. So, he saw private property as the problem. And the solution was socializing property, capital. He didn't start with scarcity. He had no understanding that private property emerges out of the reality of scarcity. Now, those who understand markets realize that you cannot have markets without some form of private property rights. In other words, transferable. Voluntary exchange. So, Adam Smith said private property is the solution because he understood scarcity. He said, we got to solve this problem with scarcity. How do we do it? Well, give people private property, require under the rule of law competition, equal treatment, blah, blah, blah. And we're more likely to have human flourishment, net social benefits, as he called it. Okay, so
I guess
fine.
just on the last point, the private property.
Yeah.
It's of course just to give you, we're talking about
Yeah, yeah.
communism. It just happened. The ex-Soviet Union. I was building something there. Just if you look the way, for example, in the 90s, they were distributing vouchers among.
Yeah.
And, some oligarchs bought them up quickly because people didn't understand that there is private property that gives them a chance to buy something.
Yeah.
So the problem is often that some people just don't understand what.
Again.
That's the big problem. I guess it's a question of passing.
We will never design a human institution that's perfect. And there will always be these, again, because of individual capacities and so on. You're right. Actually, one of my friends walked away from the Soviet Union with several $100 million. Because I never asked him how he got it. But, well, no, it was probably, again, through this voucher system, people were given equal amounts and so.
It was the idea that.
And for them, they said, well, look, I can buy a bottle of vodka. That bottle of vodka is worth more than this thing to me. But of course, consolidating it was worth a lot more to him. He saw a value in consolidating. They didn't. They said, okay, time preference. They had a time preference for that bottle of vodka or potato or brown bread or black bread or whatever the Russians eat. But I cannot be the master of another person's destiny. I'll get it wrong. And you are just as incapable as I. So I have an allergy to these kind of ideas that, we have to take into account that people have different. Thank God people have different capacities. I got a PhD. It's only because I, stayed here long enough and finally wanted to get rid of me, perhaps. But whatever it is, that capacity allowed me to do things I might not have done. And my students, they didn't have knowledge. They came to me for knowledge or information. Difference,